universally regarded as both her most difficult and her best and her most long-lasting. And one of the things I wanted to get to grips with, which the first draft has not got to grips with, which is why this is not a talk, is how she pulls that off. How she writes a book that is simultaneously very funny without ever compromising on the anger.
So why did you pick on, if you're interested in humour and systems, why specifically Joanna Russ and why specifically the female man?
So that's a much wider question. I was trying to remember when I first read The Female Man, and it must have been my mid-teens. There was something called the Women's Press Book Club, which you could sign up to and you picked 4 books a month. And my mother signed me up. And I discovered that they had a science fiction line and got most of them, I think. And Joanna Russ has just always intrigued me. She's a very fine writer on a line-by-line basis. And not all science fiction writers are. There are many science fiction writers I love whose prose is ordinary. It's their ideas you read. But Russ really can write. She's a political theorist, which I think really attracted me, in that I've become more interested in theories of political organising and analysis the older I've got, and the more I've become aware. So I probably started out as a liberal feminist. You can fix injustices one at a time. I am no longer a liberal feminist. I'm very much... I want to be careful because the word radical feminist has gotten attached to the transphobes, and that's not me. So let's say I'm a Marxist radical feminist, I'm a materialist feminist. You have to fix systemic injustice. And of all the feminist writers of her period, I think she was well ahead of her time on that. And that she's also very interested in what we now call intersectionalism, which is the idea that there isn't only one axis of injustice. And I can't remember the name of the black feminist who came up with it. It might come back to me later. But this idea that these things interrelate. And The Female Man is a bit... So I actually edited a collection of essays on Joanna Russ. 2009, does that sound right? Yes, 2009. And I felt we didn't do The Female Man justice. And the more I read, the more I started to feel nobody has done this book justice. So there have been 4 books on Joanna Russ's work, and they all get to The Female Man and describe it. It's a book about 4 women. They're the same woman from 4 different worlds, 2 in the future. One from a contemporary world of 1969 that never had a Second World War. And they were all very, very different. Joanna is from our world. She's an academic, she's struggling against sexism. Janine is in a world where there has been no feminist movement, there has been no advance in black people's civil rights, nothing has changed. Jael is from a world where men and women are at war, and she's trying to wipe men out. And Janet is from a world where there are no men. And one of the things that means is that in some ways Janet is not a woman, she is a human being. Because to be a woman in this book is to not be a man. I hope that makes sense. A woman becomes gendered, and one of the things Russ is arguing, and this is something I think would be much more familiar to older people in the audience, is the idea of that man is a default. So I don't know how Bulgarian works with pronouns, but there's a big row going on in Britain and America about pronoun use. Well, when I was growing up, it was actually really quite radical to insist that we didn't use the word mankind, we used human. We didn't say the writer he, we said the writer he, she. And Joanna Russ is part of that, saying women exist, but women have been gendered and men have not been. So Janet is not gendered female, because Janet is a world with no men. So, but what everybody who wrote about this book said, usually in a paragraph, was, this is a very complicated, innovative book. And then they moved on. So I sat down to write a book about how it is complicated and innovative. So I've written a 50,000 word book about a 90,000 word novel. So I've written almost as much as Russ did, just taking it apart line by line and thinking about how this book is written, how she achieves what she does. And just to throw out one thing that really caught me, she never uses metaphor. There's no metaphor in the book. Here is this incredibly experimental book, written by an English professor who knows what to do with a metaphor. And yet the book is written in plain, direct English all the way through. That is a deliberate choice she has made in order to achieve a particular thing. Haven't quite figured out what the thing.
So what are you trying to do in the book as a whole? Apart from sort of analyse the book, analyse the female man line by line, what are you going to end up?
So, I'm a science fiction fan. I really am a science fiction fan. I'm not really a critic. And some of what I want to do is just to make this book more teachable. I want to make more people want to read it. And one of the things in our field is that if you can provide people with really good secondary sources, they will teach a book. But without it, they often won't. So that's part of it. I think you're asking me as well what my argument is. Is that right? He's nodding. I don't know if you can see. I think my argument is that we haven't necessarily understood the book. The book has been looked at almost entirely through the lens of liberal feminist discourse. And I think it needs to be looked at through Marxist materialist and Jewish discourse. So this is a slightly different thing. Joanna Russ is a member of a Jewish generation that was very strongly encouraged to assimilate. And to assimilate to the degree that they didn't even really talk to each other about being Jewish. But if you, there's a book by Joyce Antler that went out to interview the radical Marxist feminists of the 1960s, and she was surprised to realize that 40% of them were from Jewish families. Mostly their parents had been part of the union movements, or they'd been part of American communism. And most of them didn't realize the others were Jewish. They'd not talked about it. But there's something in Judaism called Tikkun Olam, and that's T-I-K-K-U-N, and it means putting the world to rights. And I think that when you understand the argumentative Jewish sensibility, which basically says everything is up for grabs, everything can be argued about, it makes the book make much more structural sense, because the book is about as far from linear as you can get. You get sections when the Joannas are talking. You get sections when we're on one of the other worlds. You get sections that are pieces of Greek theatre, but totally performative. And this works if you realise that each section is contributing to putting together a piece of the jigsaw of argument. It doesn't work so well if you try to look at them separately or see them as interludes from the story. Because the story, to the degree there is one, and we only find out at the end, is that jail wants permission to put the equivalent of battle stations, military encampments, on their worlds. And that's such a thin thread. But it's not really about that, it's about how do we put the world to rights.
I have not read a lot of the criticism on Russ. What I do remember enjoying a lot was Tom Moylan's book, Demand the Impossible, where Moylan placed a female man alongside Marge Pierce's woman at a time, I can't remember the others, Susan Key Chalmers's Walk to the End of the World, 4 feminist utopias, all of them written in the 1970s.
Within about 5 years.
Within about 5 years of each other. Joanna Russ actually wrote it earlier, I think, because it wasn't published until 75, but she couldn't get it published, so she'd actually finished it several years ago. I mean, do you think it's important to put the Russ book in its in its context, i.e. 1970s feminism? What do you think and what Moylan also does, of course, is put it in the context of utopian thought. And I don't think you mentioned the word utopia yet. I mean, do you think that's important too?
So before The Female Man, there's a short story called When It Changed, set on a planet called While Away, with a character called Janet and her wife. And that is a utopia, which is just, we see beginning to be destroyed when men arrive. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether it's the same While Away and the same Janet. I don't actually think that The Female Man is a utopian novel as such, but then neither are several of the any of the novels that Edward has just named. If anything, they're all dystopias. They're all how bad can it get?
If I remember rightly, Moylan calls them all critical utopias. He admits they're not quite proper utopias, but they're playing with the concept of utopia.
I think what all of those books have in common, though, is a real problem with liberal feminism. So the main book that everybody remembers is Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which was very much aimed at a middle-class, white, educated housewife. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that Betty Friedan then tried to exclude everybody who didn't fit that from the women's liberation movement, on the grounds, and this is part of a respectability politics, it's a big issue in American civil rights movements, that if you had lesbians in the movement, it would bring the movement into discredit. If you had black women in the movement, it would confuse the issue. So I think all of these women were reacting with an anger as much to liberal feminism as they were to men. But this is actually quite traditional in movements of the left. Most identity movements of the 1960s and the 1970s are actually a reaction to white male union socialism of the period. They're not necessarily a reaction to right-wing men. A lot of the women who became involved in feminism had been involved in things like the anti-Vietnam War movement and the civil rights movement, and they've been treated really badly. And so they're very, very angry. There's a woman called Robin Morgan who says, "We have looked for the enemy and he is our own brother." They're not in a mood to take any quarter. And I think, yes, placing Russ's work, I think it's why it does get published in the 1970s, when more and more women are pushing back. And when we're starting to see more and more out lesbians in the movement. Joanna Russ, at the time the book was published, I think it only just come out as a lesbian. There's a reprint of her book about that, On Strike Against God, which is just come out. It's not science fiction, but it is about coming out as a lesbian. And in terms of putting it in context, oddly, or for all that I've spent some time doing that, I think it diminishes the book, because I think it's a book that's grown with time, although it's also become harder to teach. Both Edward and I have taught this book, and we've both experienced the young women saying, "Oh, this isn't relevant to us, it's not like that now." And usually a few years into the workplace, they come back going, "Then again, yes it is." And one of my stories about the book is I collect second-hand copies. And I collect second-hand copies because if you lend people the book, it doesn't come back. And what people would say to me was, "I read this book, I didn't really enjoy it. I'm really not sure I like it, but I was telling my friend about it, and I hope you don't mind, because I lent it to her, and that's the last I see of the book." It's not a likeable book, and I think that's interesting, that somebody would deliberately write a book that is itchy to read. It's uncomfortable. It forces you to examine your own behaviour.
In the 70s, both of us, in fact, used to buy our science fiction from a store called Andromeda, which was in central Birmingham, and I've known the owner of that for many, many years. He and I went to our first science fiction convention together, which I may say was 60 years ago this year. he sold books. And we had a chat about Female Man once, and he refused to have a copy in his shop. It made him so angry because it was so, he thought, so anti-male. I don't think it is particularly anti-male, but it's a book that is deliberately, I see, deliberately written to upset all sorts of people, and it upset a traditional male British science fiction bookseller quite considerably, which I would take it as a win as far as writers are concerned.
Oh, the book got terrible reviews, absolutely terrible. The male reviews of the time hated it, and at least one, I can't remember which reviewer it was, said, you know, if she wants to change men's minds, she should be nicer. And what he missed is that it's not men's minds she's trying to change at all. It's women's minds. It's women she is talking to. She is saying, get angry. So the Greek chorus scenes, she names the characters things like Saccharissa, as in too sweet, Lacrimosa, cries all the time. And she has them playing games such as, you know, I have 2 beautiful children, my husband has this amazing job, I come home and I make his dinner and he loves me. The next woman, I have 3 beautiful children, my husband is even richer, he buys me furs, etc. And they can compete and compete and compete. Up to the last one who says, I have 10 children, my husband's a factory worker, and they all go silent. And it's about that competing both, well, to give you a real life example, I went to a middle class Jewish school as a working class kid, and on one occasion my mother was asked not what she did, but what her husband did. You know, that kind of one. Her response was, which one? My mother was an early feminist. But she's trying to get us to question the things, and often through Janet, where there's an interaction at one of the parties. Joanna takes Janet to an earth party. And first of all, she dresses Janet up in women's clothing. And Janet discusses just how tight and uncomfortable most of it is. But various men try to chat Janet up. And Janet responds literally to the questions they ask her. So she doesn't get their jokes. She doesn't get their ironies. She doesn't get their expectations that she is supposed to laugh. And that one I'm raising because I spend a lot of time amongst American science fiction fans. And one of the things I cannot help noticing is how many American women fans still have what I call the laugh of appeasement. I don't hear it from British women fans. And I think it's fair to say that in British fandom, any man who tried it on with a British female fan would really, really, really regret it. But I hear that laughter, it's hard to explain it. When a man has said something, it's actually quite threatening. And in this scene, when somebody tries that with Janet, she breaks his arm. And when he protests, she says, well, why did you pick a fight when you don't know how to fight? And it's that whole telling us, you know, why are you playing along with this game? I mean, we know the answer, because it's dangerous for women not to. And she talks about that as well. But these challenges are there for women. This is not a book that was ever intended for male readership. And I think the male reviewers who hated it felt as threatened by that as by the actual anti-male statements. The idea that somebody would write a book that is not for them. It's just not for them. And a lot of men, and we see this in the States on Twitter, get terribly upset when you say, this isn't for you.
Could you explain a bit more how, I know you're having problems writing the sections in your book at the moment about how Russ uses humour, but perhaps you can describe it to us now.
Okay, so one of the reasons I'm struggling a little is that although she doesn't use metaphor, she does use certain figures of speech. Now, first of all, I'm going to explain the thing that I didn't understand until a few years ago about what a figure of speech means, because I suspect other people may not understand what figure of speech means. So I always thought figure of speech meant something like metaphor. It doesn't. figures of speech are about Greek rhetorical techniques of the way you structure a sentence to achieve something. And I actually have a book with all the descriptions of different ones, because when I say I'm bad at languages, this includes remembering terminology. I have to write it down and put it on the wall. But one of the ones she uses is a form of bathos, which the British phrase for might be mic drop, where you write something terribly straightforward that seems very innocent, and then you drop the thing into it. So the one I remember best, I suppose, is the one about Wildway is terribly safe. You can wander around, a young girl can wander around the world, clutching a diamond in one hand and her vagina in the other. Stop. But there are still wolves. And she does that over and over again in a way that builds up this sense of whatever she's going to say is never going to end quite the way you think it's going to end. So that particularly with the scenes with Janet, you get Janet having a misprision, a misunderstanding of the way something, a scene is working out, and drop at the end something like that. But you don't. So in one of the scenes, there's a pink book and a blue book, and the man is referring to the blue book to tell him what to do. But she's looking at the pink book and going, but you don't have to use the book. And for him, that's that moment of deflation almost. And there's a lot about humour of deflation. And trying to describe that when it doesn't quite fit the literary descriptions, because she's using this very plain language all the time. And it's tricky. And that takes me to a book written by Suzette Hayden Elgin, Native Tongue. I don't know how many people have read that. A few people. Okay, so in this book, there is a culture of translators, several families of translators who have come into being as a guild because only they can translate the aliens, and they do it by putting tiny babies in with aliens to learn the speech as natives. But it's also a sexually very repressive society, and the women of the lines of the families start developing a secret language, and it's what's called the hard Sapir-Whorf theory. The idea that you can only express certain ideas if you have the language for it. Now, the whole theory doesn't really work. Linguistics disproved it, but it's still a cool theory. And I'm finding that that's relevant because an awful lot of the descriptions of humour I've looked at describe what we might now call punching down humour. And that's not what Russ is doing. It's a kind of peer humour in which we find these things funny because we share these experiences, or we share these fears, or we share these codes. And it's tricky to describe and tricky to pull out because they aren't one-liners. There's a tradition in British humour, which is less common in American humour, of lengthy, twisty monologues, which get steadily more absurd as you go on. And I think that's closer to the way she writes. But it's not common in American humour.
Which I don't know what traditions of BotherCon are, but if this was a British Eastercon, I'd be saying, well, we've got about 5 minutes to chat now, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So I'm telling you this now, so you've got a few minutes to think of your question. But if we can sort of summarize, I mean...
Can I ask you to say one thing first? When we ask you for your question, could you come up and use the microphone, please, because I'm very deaf.
So, you've written an awful lot of stuff. That should be apparent to the audience, I think. How does what you're writing about Joanna Russ fit into your work as a whole?
I don't know, and that might be the problem. It might be why I was struggling. The nearest thing it fits into is my book Rhetoric of Fantasy, which was written in a similar way, line by line, exploring line by line. But most of my other work has been much more community rhetoric oriented. How does a group of people shape science fiction, shape Quaker philosophy? The Russ book, I don't know how it fits in, except we were talking last night over dinner about passion, and I am fascinated by people who are passionate. People who really, really care about the thing they are doing or writing, up to the point that, excuse the language, they don't give a fuck who they piss off. And Joanna Russ is absolutely in that category.
Okay, that didn't really give enough time for people to think of a question. But we do have one, yes. Could you use the microphone?
Oh,
you've
yeah,
got one,
right,
you've
that's
got one of your own, okay.
Okay, I'll ask a question.
Just lower. Just hold it lower.
Maybe I can just shout.
You'll have to translate.
It was working a minute ago.
This one is connected.
Just use this. You then stay up here and hand people the microphone.
I think that's what we should do probably. All right. So I have a couple of questions, but let's do one. You have used throughout this speech the female man as an example of resistance, but has it been successful?
Sorry?
Has it been successful?
Has what been successful?
What she has done with this book as a method of offering resistance? Because you started your expose with the idea that in 2024, we're probably not that far off from where we were in the 70s. So, is this a method that has been proven good?
The book has never been out of print, which surprised me when I went to look. It's been reprinted every decade. I think we found about 12 versions at the end. I think it's a stealth success. It's one of those books that you find people who've read it and they clutch onto you because you've read it too. It's a book that really changes people. And it's part of a wave of success. The kinds of crap that I had to deal with in my 20s, most young female graduate students would just look really puzzled if a bloke tried it on them. The constant little put-downs are way, way less common. What I often say is it's not that we don't have to deal with that shit anymore, but it tends to hit later in our lives. Doesn't hit as early as it did. So I do think it's part of the whole success. And there's a book. So the book concludes with a kind of direction to the book that it should go out there and do its stuff until the day it's no longer relevant and nobody understands it any longer. Now, sadly, I don't think we've got there yet. But I think it's still out there doing its stuff.
Doesn't she say at the end, go little book, do your stuff, which I think, if I remember, I should know, I'm a medievalist, it's a quotation from Chaucer, isn't it?
It's a poem from Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson was the woman who locked herself in her room and posted poetry to the floorboards.
I think you need to check Chaucer. Anyway.
Okay, Dickinson got it from Chaucer.
Next question.
To know more about, so this was written in the 1970s, the idea of like positioning it what it has influenced today. Like, do you find that there are books and writers that are emulating it, or do you think that is something that writers should be attempting to do and to bring it into modern dialogue?
That's a very good question. Okay, so the first thing about Joanna Russ is that all her influences are men. She was a huge fan of sword and sorcery. She was a huge fan of Robert Heinlein, who I wrote my other book on, spotting exactly the point I made, which is that Heinlein actually liked women, which is more than you can say for most of his contemporaries. Who does she influence? I'm not sure she does, in terms of writers. It's a phrase used too often, and I'm not going to pronounce it right because I don't do Latin. Sui generis?
Sui generis.
Sui generis. There are lots of people who admire her. She's, I was going to say, apart from Le Guin, she's far and away the most admired feminist, but the people who admire Le Guin are not the people who admire Russ. We're a separate group of people, okay? I will say, I am not actually much of a fan of Russ's work, of Le Guin's work, which makes me really unusual. I don't find it particularly interesting. The Russ admirers are people like Samuel Delany, Kelly Link. They're the oddballs, the experimental writers, which means they're not people who want to do what Russ did. They're people who want to be like Russ and pushing at the edge of what the genre could do. I mean, if I was to think of writers who wrote like her, Cordwainer Smith, Ted Chiang. When I used to teach science fiction, I used to teach a section that was called Science Fiction as Style, in which the thing that made the text science fiction wasn't the plot, it wasn't the idea, it was the way the text was written. And for all I've said that Russ uses plain English, I'd still put her in that. And in terms of radicalism, well, the next wave of feminists look more like Russ than Russ's contemporaries do. But once you get past the 1980s, there are very few feminists writing capital F feminist science fiction about being a feminist. That mode of writing evaporates as feminist writers become recognized and absorbed into what we call mainstream science fiction. They start writing feminist space opera, they write feminist First Contact, they write feminist near future, but they stop writing feminist fiction about being a feminist and challenging the world as a feminist. Does that help? And it is a very noticeable shift. Another question. See the person with the rather splendid spectacles.
So, you mentioned that Delaney as an example of someone who was influenced by her. Delaney, Simon Delaney. And when you were talking about how it is presented in Tokyo, did you? So Delaney wrote Trouble on Triton. And do you think Trouble on Triton, where the way it treats gender in their community, is deeply influenced by female men?
So Delaney had already read The Female Man in manuscript when he wrote Trouble on Triton. So they look contemporary, but they're actually not. So it's a really good question. So I know he was influenced that. So the issue on gender is a bit more complicated and also sour in that both books are transphobic. Russ constructs sex changes as something forced upon young men because they fail at being men, which is absolutely normal. Heinlein does the same thing in I Will Fear No Evil, Angela Carter does the same thing in The Passions of Eve. It's absolutely the standard meme of the time. It's slightly less enforced and it's much more of a choice in Triton. But again, the main character has a sex change because he thinks becoming a woman will mean that the kind of people he's attracted to will be attracted to him. Both Delaney and Russ retracted on that, but Russ towards the end of her life. So I think we have to see that one as the oxygen in which they were breathing at the time. And I'll say it flat out, back in the 1980s, I would be what we now call the trans-exclusionary radical feminist. There's a book that came out contemporaneously to The Female Man called Sally Ann Gearhart's The Wonderground, also published by the Women's Press. We all read it. We were all very, very influenced by the book's transphobia. Some of us realised it was a load of rubbish. Unfortunately, some people didn't. So I can see where that is coming from. And that's very much a shared position. On a better note, what both books do is really challenge the idea that there is one way of being gendered and one way of being a person. I mean, I'm just sad that, as I know Delaney is, that Russ stopped writing so young. She had a series of accidents, she had what I think was now recognised as ME, and pretty much stopped in her early 60s. Does that sound about right? She didn't write anything after the 1990s. So we don't know that much. But there's definitely a connection. Delaney and Russ stayed friends all their life. She was also really close to James Tiptree Jr. Now, I read Julie Phillips' biography of Tiptree and came away from that with a different conclusion than Phillips came away from. Phillips came away seeing Tiptree as a lesbian, and I think there's a much, much stronger grounds to argue that Tiptree's persona was more, I'm being delicate here, was more than a persona. Okay, I can't prove anything. But Tiptree more or less stops writing once exposed because Tiptree needs that persona. And I suspect that would have influenced both Delaney and Russ to rethink what they thought about gender issues around that. It's always tricky because so much of our language has shifted. I mean, full disclosure here, I am straight, and quite a few of the very butch women I dated when I was younger have all transitioned. That's not because of some weirdo they were converted. It was because language became available to express what you need to express. Yeah, it's a complicated one. It's very hard to project. I mean, the really controversial one, which I did hint at in my book on Heinlein, is I think there's very strong evidence in Heinlein's own writing that he wasn't cisgendered. And I can't prove it. And I'll never be able to prove it because Virginia went through and edited his archives. But I think there's a reason why Heinlein and Russ, two very unlikely possible friends, got on very well. So that's a bit of a rambling answer.
I don't know.
Are we out of time?
I was going to say, I don't know how strict these conventions run to time, but I have a reputation of being strict, so we're going to end it there. It is 1:45 to the hour, and we need a little break before we face. Anyway, before the next session. Next session starting at 4. So thank you very much, audience, for your attention and participation, and thank you above all to Fara.
Thank you to Edward, who I asked to interview me at lunchtime. But he's had 30 years to prepare. Thank you. And also, I'll do this at the end of the session, but thank you so much to Elena and the team for inviting me here. It's been a great pleasure.
Ако не го направим, е това. И някой ще трябва да влезе.